Welcome AP Economics students to the second day of online learning and also the second day of Unit 11 Factor Markets. As you can see, AP exam dates have not yet changed. We haven't heard any update from there. In terms of our objectives, we're going to be taking a look at capital, land, and labor, and what their supply and what their demand curves look like. We have a question of the day, which if you can please take a question of the day notebook. A good idea is to press pause and write down the question, and then when you press play, we'll go over the answer. So why don't you pause that right now and see if you can figure out this question. Okay, welcome back. So if you take a look at the question of the day that you should have written down, which of the following industries have the potential for long-run profits? The answer is D, monopoly and oligopoly. We know that in monopolistic competition and in perfect competition, if they are experiencing profits in the short run, and firms can enter the market, which will change the supply curve and the demand curve for industries and thus making them have normal profit. Okay, so that's the question of the day. In terms of what's going on, what our calendar looks like, if you look at this next slide. So today we're looking at land, capital, and labor. We are on day 2. For homework, you must complete modules 72 and 73 by next class. By the end of the day today, there is a short Google form with some multiple choice questions based on topics that we went through today. It shouldn't take you that long. It's only 5 questions, but that is going to be due at the end of the day. So after you watch this video, I highly suggest that you do that. You can find that in classwork in our Google Classroom. Long-term things you want to be thinking about, the Quizlet module 69 to 73, that is going to be due the day of your exam. And the Unit 11 graded quiz, I would do that. That's Kepler saying hello. I would do that before the Unit 11 exam. Kepler, come over here. So here are some objectives that are directly from your textbook. So the first, this is going to be from Module 70, is when we talk about the price, how much it costs for capital or how much it costs for land, we call it rental rate, even though it might not be a formally renting situation. We call land and capital rental rate. We call labor wage rate. The same rule that we use for labor, where we are going to hire or add additional units of capital and additional units of labor until the value that unit of labor or that unit of capital is going to be equal to the rental rate. So this is the exact same concept as MR equals MC, that marginal analysis. When you add one more for capital, maybe you add one more oven in your pizza store. If you are doing landscaping, you add one more lawnmower, things of that nature. That's what we're looking at there. Okay, so we'll have plenty of practice with this. Now, next class, we're going to see what happens when you put all of these together. Okay, so that'll be next class. But for our purposes, it's marginal analysis. That's the basic idea there. The most important thing that you need to get out of this module is what the supply curve looks like for land and what the supply curve looks like for capital. As you can notice for land, the supply curve for land is, first of all, they're both upward sloping, but the supply curve for land is very inelastic. It's very steep. The reason why is that when you're talking about land, first of all, obviously you're talking about physical land and physical location. There's only a fixed amount of land on this earth. So that's why it has a relatively inelastic supply. When you're talking about natural resources, they only have a fixed amount of resources available on this earth. So land is something that is going to be relatively inelastic, the supply of it, okay? There's only a fixed amount. So that's one thing to first take a look at. The second thing that you want to take a look at is the market for capital. They generally tend to have, when you talk about the supply, a relatively elastic market for capital. What that means is that capital is something that's man-made. And in most situations, something that's man-made, you can just make more of it. So like, hey, I need more of this, I need more ovens, I need more tests, I need more, whatever the unit of capital is, something that's man-made. Just go to a factory and make more of it. So that's why the supply curves are different, and it's very important that you know that generally the supply curves are different. The demand curves just look like regular demand curves. So this will, really remind you of like what we did in Unit 1, like a product market, just a regular supply and demand curve. So as you can see for land, we have quantity of land on the x-axis. We have rental rate written on the y-axis. Where the equilibrium is what the rental rate is going to be and the quantity, and then what the rental rate, how much you're actually going to pay for that, looks the same in the capital graph. So pretty standard stuff that we're used to so far. The marginal productivity theory essentially says that because labor is such a huge part of both of all the factor markets, it's more important than capital, it's more important than land, that its marginal product is greater in value than land and capital. And we'll see examples of that when we look a little bit further next class. Okay, so that's just kind of a vocab word that you need to be aware of. So here's an example, like a check your understanding, if you will. Suppose that farmland in the United States is exchanged in a competitive market. Use a correctly labeled graph of this market to show the equilibrium rental rate and quantity of farmland. Okay, so take a couple of seconds and write this down in your notebook. Now that you drew that farmland graph, and feel free to pause it if I'm going too fast, let's look at part A. Suppose that a growing global population increases the demand for agricultural products grown in the United States. In this graph, show how this impacts the market for farmland in the United States. So here's what your graph should look like. We have rental rate per acre, we have land. My supply curve is going to be relatively inelastic, okay? Because it's farmland, there's only a fixed amount of it. That's why it gets that looking type of supply curve. And it's very important that you know how to draw that. The demand curve is pretty basic. It's downward sloping. That's regular. Now, if the global population increases the need for agricultural products, my demand curve is going to increase, okay? Thus increasing the rental rate for this. And you really should have the equilibrium written. Okay, Kepler, nobody cares about what you say. Now suppose that the market for farmland has been converted into residential subdivisions, like in Part B. In your graph in Part A, show how this trend affects the market for farmland in the United States. So in this situation, farmland that used to be available is now being made into residential plots. So that actually decreases the supply. So this, if you see where my mouse is, this was the original equilibrium. and that would be that rental rate. Let's call it like 100 just to make things easy. Then our demand goes up. Here is our new equilibrium rental rate. Now let's say that the rate for land is like 200. And now that the supply has decreased, here's our another new one, and that could make it like 300. So it's very important just to think of demand and supply. What would change the supply of something and what would change the demand of something? And we will have plenty of time to take a look at that. Here is another example. Okay, refer to the table below. Assume that the price of the product is $5 and the rental rate for the capital is 200 per unit. So let's say, for example, that the units of capital that we're taking a look at here is pizza ovens. Okay, and each pizza we can get $5 for. So if you look at this table, this is what it's telling us. When you go from no ovens, at 0 ovens, 0 pizzas get made. When the first oven gets produced, that first oven gives you 50. When the second oven is produced, total you have 95. But marginally, the second oven is only giving you 45. Math majors, how do we get that? 95 minus 50 equals 45, okay? So what I have to do is find out what the marginal product is for each unit of capital, okay? And then from there, I can take a look at how much value that unit of capital is bringing, and then I can compare it to the 200. So the first unit gives me 50 pizzas. 50 pizzas go for $5 each, which means that the value of the marginal product, the value of this oven, is $250. If that oven is giving me $250 worth of product and the oven only costs me $200 to make, do I buy the first oven? Yes, I do, because 250 is greater than 200. This is the exact same thing that we talked about last class. It's really the exact same thing that we've been talking about in microeconomics. So this makes sense. This is that marginal analysis. It's so important. What about going from the second guy? Well, when I go from 50 to 95, the second oven gives me 45 pizzas, so the marginal product is 45. Each pizza I can get $5 for it. So 45 times 5 is $225. Do I do it? Yes, because $225 is how much money I'm going to be making in pizza. That is greater than the $200 that the oven is going to cost me. When I look at the third, from the third one, we go to the third oven. I get from 95 pizzas to 135 pizzas total, which means that 135 minus 95 is 40. 40 times 5 is 200. Yes, when they are equal to each other, the oven costs me $200. The value is $200. We do add the third oven to our pizzeria because it makes sense to do. But then when we get to the fourth oven, we go from 135 to 165. So the fourth oven is only going to give us 30 pizzas, 30 marginal product. 30 pizzas times $5 a pizza is going to give us 150. The oven is more expensive than the amount of pizzas that it's going to give us. So no, it doesn't make sense to buy the fourth oven. The profit maximizing factor in this situation is 3 ovens, okay? You would do the same thing with land. You do the same thing with labor. We're going to combo all 3 of those next class, okay? So that's module 70. Now we're going to be taking a look at module 71. The supply of labor is tricky. Okay. Labor is tricky because when you decide, hey, should I work or should I have leisure time? That's a question that a lot of us ask. And the answer to that question is, well, it depends how much you are getting paid per hour. Because if you're getting paid a lot per hour, it makes sense to work to a certain point And then at a certain point, it actually makes sense to not work because you want to enjoy the amount of money that you have in utility. Okay. If you're somebody that's not making a lot of money, it makes a lot of sense to work more because then you can, add up those dollars and use marginal utility later. Okay. So it really depends on your cost of leisure. All right. Now, so there's this idea of a reservation wage, that a person must receive more than his or her reservation wage before they supply any hours to the market. I'm a teacher. I get paid a decent amount of money to work at Morris Hills Regional District, and it just wouldn't make sense for me to, go teach if I was getting paid $5 an hour. So I have like a reservation wage that's a little bit higher than that, obviously, because in order for me to give up hanging out with my annoying dog and my fun son, there has to be an amount of money that makes it worth it. So if you take a look at this slide here, this is an individual supply curve. And sometimes in this situation, the substitution effect dominates, which means that you might be in a situation where you're not making that much money. It makes more sense for you to work than for you to hang out and spend money. So at low wages, individually, it makes sense to supply more hours because that makes more sense to you. The income effect dominates if, let's say, that you are, just for an extreme example, like Mark Cuban. Mark Cuban doesn't actually physically work that much because his per hour is very high. He makes a lot of money, and therefore he doesn't. There's only a fixed amount of hours in a day. He wants to be able to use the money that he already has to maybe go on a trip, to go sign up for a yoga class, to do something like that. So in that situation, the income effect dominates. So what we are looking at here is at an individual supply curve. An individual supply curve, nope, this is not a typo. An individual supply curve kind of looks like it starts to go up when wages are low, and then when wages are high, and the income effect is actually stronger than the substitute effect, it actually starts to go back. So it is sort of a squiggly line. This is what an individual supply of labor looks like. Will you need to draw this? Probably not. Do you need to understand this? Yes. You need to understand why it starts to go up and then it goes back. And that all depends on, remember, there's 24 hours a day. When you're here making a lot of money, you want to be able to use that money for a trip, to go to a theme park, to go to the movies, go to an expensive restaurant. So that's the situation there. Okay. And again, that's where your work more, work less looks at. We call this a back bending curve. So if you see it in a multiple choice question, that's what they're talking about here. Okay. All right, so that's your individual labor supply curve. A regular supply curve is just upward sloping. Very important for you to know that why a market labor supply curve might shift. If you have a situation where there's more people that are now participating in the workforce. So for example, if this was individual supply curve. This is like Laura Foley's individual supply curve. When we're talking about shifting the labor supply curve, that is just a regular upward sloping supply curve, and that includes everybody's labor. Okay. So for example, after World War II, we had more women participating in the workforce, so that increased the supply of labor to the right. If you had a situation where more people were staying home, or maybe, like for example, after the progressive era, if child labor goes down, that would decrease the supply of labor. Okay, so changes in preferences, social norms, that might be a reason why the supply curve might shift. Another reason is population. You have a lot of immigration, that's going to increase your supply curve. You have a lot of people emigrating, leaving your country, that might decrease the supply curve. When you take a look at birth rates, when you take a look at death rates, any change in population, if you have to think about the workforce, that might change the labor supply curve to the right. Again, just when we're talking about market labor, it's just a upward sloping curve. And if obviously if population goes down, that decreases supply. Changes in opportunities. You might have a situation where there are more jobs, like for example in Silicon Valley, which is my top picture over here, that might, you know, increase people that didn't maybe want to be a part of the workforce, that maybe now they're interested in joining the workforce. So that increase in opportunity might increase the supply of labor to a particular industry, but at the same time, a lot of people are, kind of going away from coal and mining industries because of the horrible health effects. So in those areas, you might see a decrease of supply and labor in that industry. So these are where you might see a multiple choice question about something like this. Think of logic when you are approaching these. Okay. Change in wealth. If, for example, if people are, if the home values or if the stock market goes up, I'm going to tell you right now, if people look at the stock market today and how horrible that it's doing, when people's wealth goes down, that might mean that people need to feel like they need to work more because what was in their 401ks, what their homes might have been worth, maybe it's not that much anymore. So maybe somebody that wasn't going to work says, you know what, I need to work a little bit more to increase my wealth. Conversely, when you have situations where, wealth is getting a little bit higher, people are less likely to work because they are, receiving wealth in other ways. Okay, so these are reasons why your labor supply curve might shift. So here is what a standard market labor supply curve and what a market labor demand curve looks like. This is a perfectly competitive market. There are situations where the product market or the labor market is not perfectly competitive. Okay, so this is what a perfectly competitive market labor curve looks like. But in this situation, this is imperfect competition in the product market. So this might be like monopolistic competition. This might be oligopoly, and this might be monopoly, because if you notice, the product price changes. When the product price is different, when it's not a price taker like perfect competition, you might have a situation where your revenues change a little bit. So that's just something that's important to look at because your marginal revenue product of labor is going to be a little bit different there. Okay. And in some situations, we might have a different cost in labor. So notice here how the wage rates differ as you go up. So that just be aware that sometimes wage rates aren't always constant, and sometimes product prices aren't always constant, obviously. We call for like the product market, when it's an imperfect competition in product market, we call it marginal revenue product. When it's perfect competition, we call it value marginal product of labor. So they really mean the same thing. It just means one has to deal with different prices of product. That's marginal revenue product. That's more common. One is when it's perfect competition. Okay. You might have a situation where you have imperfect competition in a labor market. This is a vocabulary word known as a monopsony, and that is when one firm in a business is the single buyer of a factor of production. So like one company employs all coal miners, okay? That they would have a monopsony, which means they have a little bit more control over what the wage rate would look like. And we're going to spend a little bit more time looking at that. Okay. Let's do a check your understanding here. So, formally, Clive was free to work as many or as few hours per week as he wanted. But now there is a new law that limits the maximum number of hours he can work per week to 35. Explain under what circumstances, if any, he is made worse off, if he is made equally well off, or if he is made better off. So for letter A, actually, you know what? If you want to pause this, see if you can do this. This should be in your guided notes. Okay, welcome back. So let's see if we have the answers to this. Clive is made worse off if, before the new law, he had preferred to work more than 35 hours per week. As a result of the new law, he can no longer choose his preferred time. Maybe he wanted to work 40, maybe he wanted to work 45, 50. He now consumes fewer goods because he's not making as much money and more leisure than he would like. He would be made equally well off if his utility is unaffected by the law because before the law, he had preferred to work either 35 hours or fewer per week. The law has not changed his preferred time allocation, so he is equally well off. Under these circumstances, for letter C, Clive can never be better off by the law because he is restricted by the number of hours that he can work. He can only be made worse off or equally well off. So if he wants to change and maybe go on an expensive vacation or buy a more a crazier car that gives him higher utility, or a dinner that gives him more, he can't do those things under the new law. Okay, so that's Module 70 and Module 71 in a nutshell. What I'm going to remind you with our online learning is that your job is to complete Modules 72 and 73 for next class. So you have until next class to do that. Modules 70 and 71, really right after you watch this, I'd like you to go to the Google form and see how you're doing. As always, from 12 to 1, I will be in our Google Hangouts. So if you would like to, chat, ask some questions, talk, that would be great. So I hope that everybody's healthy. I hope that everyone's well. I'll talk to you soon.